You may have heard someone say Czechoslovakia when they actually meant the Czech Republic, Slovakia, or sometimes both at the same time. For many people, especially older generations, it still feels like one country with different names. And the truth is, not that long ago, it actually was. Czechs and Slovaks are remarkably similar. Their languages are close enough that they can usually understand each other without much effort. Their cultures, mentality, sense of humor, and even the way they see the world were shared for many years. And that's exactly what makes the story of their separation so interesting. Because this isn't the usual story about a violent war, a bloody conflict, or a sudden explosion of hatred between two nations. Quite the opposite. It's the story of two peoples who managed to live together for a long time, and who even today often speak about each other like close neighbors, sometimes almost like family. So if they were so similar, if they shared one country for decades, and if they were never openly hostile toward one another, what actually caused Czechoslovakia to disappear? What happened along the way that a country which survived wars, occupations, and decades of communism ultimately fall apart in a time of peace? The origins of Czechoslovakia. To understand this, we need to go back more than 100 years. It's 1918. World War I is coming to an end, and with it, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a vast state that had controlled large parts of Central Europe for decades, begins to collapse. Out of that chaos, new countries start to emerge, often built around shared language, culture, and identity. That's when the idea appears to unite the lands of Bohemia, Moravia, and Slovakia into a single state. The people living in these regions were quite similar. Their languages belonged to the same family. Their traditions were closely related, and many believed that together they would simply have a better chance of surviving in this new and uncertain Europe. And that's how Czechoslovakia was born. At first, the new country actually worked. Czechoslovakia became a parliamentary democracy led by Thomas Masaryk, and Prague quickly grew into the political and economic center of the entire state. Compared with many other places in this part of Europe, it was relatively stable, fairly modern, and quite industrialized. For that reason, it was often described as a kind of democratic island in a region that was still trying to figure out how to function after the collapse of the great empires. But that stability didn't last long. World War II. By the late 1930s, dark clouds were gathering over Europe. Hitler was steadily carrying out his expansionist plans, and Czechoslovakia found itself in an increasingly difficult position. Within its borders lived a large German minority, especially in the border regions known as Sudetenland, and this issue quickly became the perfect excuse for German pressure. In 1938, the Munich Conference took place. At the table sat the leaders of the major European powers, Britain, France, Germany, and Italy, and there they made the decision to hand the Sudetenland over to Germany. There was just one problem. Representatives of Czechoslovakia weren't even invited to the conference. They were simply informed of the outcome and forced to accept the decision. The country was suddenly weakened, and this was a moment when the stability of the state began to crumble. Not long after, Germany occupied the Czech lands and created the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. Meanwhile, Slovakia formally became a separate state, though in reality it was heavily dependent on Nazi Germany. This marked the first real breakup of Czechoslovakia, forced, chaotic, and completely shaped by the interests of stronger powers. But the war eventually came to an end, and with it, the balance of power across Europe changed again. The Red Army entered Czechoslovakia, officially as liberators, and for a moment, it seemed the country might return to normal. And in a sense, it did. Czechoslovakia was restored. But the reality returned to was very different from the one that had existed before the war. Czechoslovakia, another Soviet state. Soviet influence began to grow stronger and stronger. In 1948, the communists took full control of the country, and Czechoslovakia entered an entirely new era. The Czechoslovak Socialist Republic was established, where politics, the economy, education, practically every aspect of life became shaped by a system modeled on the Soviet Union. The Communist Party gradually took control of the military, the police, and state institutions. In the years that followed, the country settled into a rigid, highly centralized regime. During this time, people rarely spoke openly about tensions between Czechs and Slovaks, not because they didn't exist, but because in such a political environment, there was simply no space for open discussion. The state was expected to be unified, loyal, and obedient. Then, in the 1960s, something happened that gave people a sense of hope. A politician named Alexander Dubček rose to prominence. He believed that communism could be reformed, that the system could be made more humane. His idea became known as socialism with a human face. Careful reforms began to appear, slightly greater freedom, a little more honesty in the media, greater freedom of speech, and attempts to loosen the grip on the economy. For many people, it was the first time in years that it felt like real change might be possible, that perhaps the system didn't have to be so suffocating, that people might finally be able to breathe a little more freely. But in Moscow, these changes were seen very differently. There, they looked like the beginning of something extremely dangerous. On the night of August 21, 1968, roughly 500,000 Warsaw Pact troops entered Czechoslovakia. Soldiers from the Soviet Union, Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, and East Germany. Thousands of tanks rolled into the streets in a full demonstration of force. Dubček was removed from power and taken away, and he was replaced by Gustav Husak, a politician far more loyal to Moscow. The reforms that had given people hope only months earlier were almost immediately reversed. Another long period of stagnation followed. The system returned to its old patterns: control, censorship, informants, and virtually no real influence for ordinary citizens. Many people lost faith that anything could ever change. At the time, the safest strategy was simply not to stand out. Live quietly, don't ask questions, don't challenge the system. But beneath the surface, something was slowly building. For years, it had seemed as though communism was permanent and unshakable. Yet, by the late 1980s, the system began to crumble almost everywhere. Across the Eastern Bloc, tensions were rising. Political changes were unfolding in Poland. The Berlin Wall fell in Germany, and people in country after country began speaking more openly about their frustration. In Czechoslovakia, the atmosphere was becoming increasingly tense as well. In November 1989, the first ideas for public demonstrations began to appear. Officially, such protests were still illegal. The system was still in place, the government still held enormous power, and society had spent decades learning that speaking out too loudly could come with serious consequences. But then an opportunity appeared, one that the authorities initially didn't see as a real threat. The demonstration of November 17. A demonstration was planned for November 17 to commemorate a student who had been killed by the Nazis 50 years earlier. Originally, the event was meant to be peaceful, more symbolic than political. It was partially organized by official youth organizations, kept under supervision, with a planned route that avoided the city center. But reality quickly slipped out of control. People started showing up in huge numbers. Some heard about the event on the radio, others saw something about it on television, and many simply joined after noticing crowds gathering in the streets. And suddenly, it was no longer just a memorial march. Banners began to appear, slogans spread through the crowd, and emotions that had been suppressed for years finally started to surface. What had started as an anti-Nazi commemoration was turning into something much bigger. Then the police moved in. Batons, police dogs, arrests. People began to retreat. Some tried to run. Others were simply pushed back by force. Within a short time, dozens were beaten, many were detained, and several people were taken to hospitals. The scale of the violence wasn't as extreme as in some other countries of the Eastern Bloc, but for society, it was still a shock. For a brief moment, a rumor spread that one of the students had been killed during the crackdown. To this day, it's unclear how much of that story was true. Some later claimed that it had been deliberately spread to intensify the public reaction. But whether anyone actually died or not, the result was the same. People stopped being afraid. What happened on November 17, 1989 became the spark. Instead of intimidating the population, the brutal response only mobilized it. In the days that followed, the protests began to grow rapidly. more and more people took to the streets, and more began saying out loud what had previously only been whispered. Just 3 days later, 500,000 people gathered in Prague's Wenceslas Square. 500,000. The role of Václav Havel. New leaders soon began to emerge. Among them, Václav Havel, a writer, dissident, and a man who for years had symbolized resistance against the communist system. He quickly became one of the most recognizable faces of the entire movement. There's also one image that remains strongly associated with that time. Thousands of people standing in the square, shaking bunches of keys in the air. The sound symbolized the end of an old era. We are closing the door. It's time to move forward. The protests spread across the entire country. Underground newspapers became more active. People stopped hiding their opinions. And for the first time in decades, the authorities could see just how many citizens had simply had enough. And importantly, all of this happened without violence from the protesters themselves. There were no street battles and no bloody clashes, which is why these events later became known as a Velvet Revolution. Soft, peaceful, and yet unstoppable. What happened in Czechoslovakia during those weeks later left many observers in disbelief. The British historian Timothy Garton Ash described the revolution as something fast, entirely peaceful, and at moments almost joyful and absurdly human. And indeed, it is hard to find another moment in history when a system that had controlled nearly every aspect of life for 40 years simply collapsed under the pressure of people standing in the streets with keys in their hands, shouting that they had had enough. On November 28, 1989, the authorities finally realized that it was over. There was no intervention from Moscow, no tanks like in 1968, and no longer the force that for decades had kept order across the Eastern Bloc. The Soviet Union itself was weakening and no longer had the power or the will to rescue another collapsing system. The communist leadership stepped down. The process of rebuilding a multi-party political system began, and not long after that, Václav Havel, the former dissident and symbol of opposition to the regime, became president. The first free elections. In the summer of 1990, the first free elections were held. The communists lost them decisively. Their power essentially disappeared within just a few months. It seemed like a completely new chapter was beginning, democratic, calmer, and finally normal. But at that exact moment, when the system collapsed, when censorship disappeared, and when people could finally speak openly about everything, something that had been suppressed for years returned: the old tensions between Czechs and Slovaks. In reality, those tensions had existed since the very beginning of their shared state in 1918. Even then, debates emerged about whether Slovaks were an equal nation within the country or simply part of a broader Czechoslovak identity. In the early years of the state, many administrative positions in Slovakia were held by Czechs, mainly because they had more experience, better education, and stronger institutional support. On one hand, this helped build the new state. On the other, it created the feeling that Slovaks were somewhat on the sidelines, less heard and less influential. Then came the war, followed by decades of communism. With a common enemy and a shared struggle for survival, these differences faded into the background, but they never completely disappeared. Differences and breakup of Czechoslovakia. After 1989, everything suddenly resurfaced, not in the form of street fights or open conflict, but in the form of questions. What should the new state look like? How quickly should reform be introduced? Who should make the key decisions? And how should the economy be divided? The Czech lands were more industrialized and wealthier, while Slovakia was still catching up. Some wanted to move quickly toward a free market economy, while others feared they would be left behind. Over time, these discussions moved from society into politics. In the Czech Republic, Václav Klaus was gaining influence, while in Slovakia, Vladimir Messier was becoming increasingly powerful. The two leaders had very different visions for the country's future, and even though many ordinary people still felt that a shared state made sense, among political elites, the idea began to grow that it might simply be easier for each nation to go its own way. What's interesting is that public opinion polls at the time showed that many citizens weren't actually hoping for a split. Many were used to the shared state and the shared history, but politics had started moving according to its own logic. Other differences also became more visible. The Czech lands were far more secular, while Slovakia remained significantly more religious. The structure of the economies was different, the pace of reforms was different, and expectations toward the state were different as well. And once a common enemy that had united everyone for decades disappeared, those differences became impossible to ignore. Step by step, the idea of separation began to appear, a separation that would later be known as a velvet divorce. The velvet divorce. At first, the tensions appeared in ways that seemed almost symbolic. In 1990, a dispute broke out over something surprisingly small: the country's name. President Václav Havel proposed removing the word socialist from it and introducing a new official name. But suddenly, a long debate erupted over whether the name should include a hyphen separating the Czech and Slovak parts of the state. For many people it seemed trivial, but for others it was a question of identity. The argument became so well known that it even gained its own nickname, the hyphen war. And although a compromise was eventually reached, it was a first moment when people began to notice that something deeper was changing beneath the surface. In the following months, discussions began about the future structure of the state. What powers should the federal government have? How much authority should the Czech and Slovak governments hold individually? And how should responsibility for the economy be divided? These negotiations dragged on for months. The people at the table changed, new rounds of talks were organized, and no real breakthrough appeared. Over 2 years, nearly 40 negotiation rounds took place. The biggest disagreements centered around money and the future of the economy. In Prague, leaders were planning rapid reforms and major industrial restructuring. The problem was that many of the arms factories scheduled for closure because they were no longer profitable were located in Slovakia. For the Czech side, it was an economic necessity. For Slovakia, it looked like a future of rising unemployment. Slovak politicians began accusing the Czech leadership of designing reforms primarily for their own economic benefit, while the cost would largely fall on Slovakia. Václav Klaus and Vladimir Messier, both firmly convinced they were right, gradually realized that their visions for the country's future were simply incompatible. The real negotiations began after the elections in 1992. They met repeatedly in different places, but one meeting in particular became historic. In June, another round of talks took place in Brno, at the famous Villa Tugendhat, a modernist house with a large garden that suddenly became the stage for one of the most important political moments in Central European history. It was there that an episode occurred which people would later talk about for years. When negotiations reached a deadlock, Klaus and Messier stepped outside into the garden to speak privately. No advisors, no cameras. The conversation lasted more than 2 hours. To this day, no one has revealed exactly what was said. What is known is that when they returned inside, the atmosphere had completely changed. A few weeks later, on August 26, 1992, the two prime ministers officially announced that on January 1, 1993, Czechoslovakia would cease to exist and be replaced by 2 separate states. A plan was established to divide the country's assets, military, and institutions. The decision was made largely without direct public involvement, without a referendum, as a result of months of political negotiations, and in a way sealed during that quiet conversation in the villa's garden. After that, only the technical details remained. In November 1992, agreements were signed outlining the division of the state, its property, its military, and its institutions. And then, during the night of December 31st, 1992, Czechoslovakia simply ceased to exist. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one.